Welcome to this episode of the Fourscore and Seven Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. My name is Roger Clark, your host. Today, once again, we return to a subject that is possibly the most contentious and controversial topic in America. This is part two of the immigration crisis, and we will continue with our efforts to peel back the bewildering onion layers of this complex and politicized issue to better understand the causes and implications of just what might be the most profound transition of a single civilization because of uncontrolled immigration in thousands of years. Once again, we are pleased to have as our guest today the eminent scholar Jeremy Carl. You may remember from last time that he's currently a fellow at the Claremont Institute in Southern California, a past research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and a former deputy assistant secretary with the Department of the Interior. Jeremy is a graduate of Yale University and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And he is the best-selling author of the book, The Unprotected Class, that's now available in bookstores and online. Welcome once again, Jeremy.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, we started last time, and our listeners will remember this, we were comparing the fall of the ancient Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire, to uncontrolled immigration, with the uncontrolled immigration that's going on in the United States today and the implication that it has, whether rightly or wrongly, whether the United States may fall from the same fate that the Roman Empire once upon a time suffered because of a creation of a new civilization and the collapse of the government and the culture of that civilization. We finished with the question, with the rapid transition in American society today, can America as we know it and its institutions survive? And I want to come back in part two of this episode and begin with that question. What risk are our institutions exposed to at the present time because of the uncontrolled immigration that we're experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the risks are huge and existential, which is why I kind of posed that question. I mean, you kind of have a certain cultural memory and an institutional memory that with uncontrolled immigration is at risk of being lost. There's sort of a way of doing things. There's what we would call a kind of high trust society. Again, when you have a rapid change in the composition of a population, whether it's by legal or illegal means, you have a reduction in that trust. And there's in fact a very well-known sociologist named Robert Putnam at Harvard who wrote a book called Bowling Alone that maybe some of your viewers will have heard of. But one of the things that he found in his research is that as a society becomes more and more diverse, particularly over a rapid period of time, social trust really collapses. And interestingly, not just kind of social trust in between groups, and you might be able to kind of understand why that might be the case, but even within groups, social trust tends to collapse. So Asian Americans will trust other Asian Americans less in a highly diverse society. That's not an intuitive finding, but that is a finding, at least to me, but it is a finding that Putnam has in his work. But even more so, we lack a sort of sense of a common history, a common tradition that we appeal to, a sort of common goal in being Americans. And we have people coming in with radically different kind of ideas of the good, cultural traditions of government. And so invariably, that is going to have a tendency to kind of weaken our existing institutions. And again, that's irrespective of whether the individual immigrant themselves is or him or herself is a sensational person who wants to contribute, but it's just a certain number, you're going to attenuate your existing traditions. It's just a math problem, basically.
Referring to the math problem, do the social scientists give us any idea of what is the maximum amount of annual immigration that any nation can sustain without being at risk of losing its long-standing institutions and traditions?
I'm not aware of it. And if I were, I would be very skeptical of mathematizing the problem in that strict a way. I would say that we're already, just without kind of trying to come up with an overarching theory, when I look at our society, when I look in particular at California, we're past that point. And I saw back when I lived in the Palo Alto area, amongst a very, very high functioning pro-social group of neighbors, but neighbors from all around the world, mostly not neighbors with long kind of family traditions in the US, that eventually these traditions kind of attenuate, and even social cooperation between groups attenuates, and just the the kind of general community doesn't have the same cohesiveness that it used to. So I don't know that there's any kind of one point estimate number that I'd point to, but I'd say that unfortunately California is blown well past that, which doesn't mean that you should just throw up your hands and do nothing, but it does really point to the importance of getting control of our immigration system, slowing the pace of immigration quite a bit so that we can, as best we can, assimilate the immigrants who we already have here.
You had a fascinating comment and observation, and you said that in the last 6 decades, America's government has created a new American people. What does that mean?
Yeah, it can mean a lot of things, but one of the things that it means is that you've brought in a bunch of people from well outside of America's historic traditions. Again, if you were to go back, so modern immigration policy in America, to slightly but not meaningfully oversimplify, is kind of governed by a law called the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965. That was what replaced the 1925 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, or sorry, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. And Hart-Celler, when it was passed, we were promised, oh, it's not going to, literally, I mean, promised in the debates, this isn't going to change the demographics of the US in big ways, blah, blah, blah. It's just kind of fixing things. And in fact, it kind of created a radically new country with perspective to demographics. So what do I mean by that? If you were to go back and look at the 1960 census, which was the last one done before Hart-Celler, you would find a country that it was about 85% non-Hispanic white, 10 or 11% African American, and 4% everything else, and that's Asian Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans. Interestingly, also the Hispanic population, we had a number of these in California at the time, 80% native born at this point, as opposed to less than 60% today. So in many cases, the Hispanic population of the US at that time is very well integrated into the sort of broader Anglo, if you will, majority. And many of them, in the cases of, say, parts of California and Texas, are actually people who had been in the United States since before those states were even part of the United States. So they have very long, deep roots in the culture and tradition. Fast forward to 2020, after Hart-Celler and 60 years of that, and we're at about, I think, 57 or 58% white non-Hispanic country at this point. Among the youth in the country, it is now a white minority, and you've had a total inversion, a kind of demographic revolution that's taken place. And every passing day, we have more and more that kind of happening, because disproportionately immigrants to the United States are not coming from the traditional sources in Europe, which provided substantially all of our immigrants up through the Hart-Celler law, but from all around the world. So it's really been a dramatic change.
So the Hart-Celler law, I believe, is a law that made it, I think, family immigration. You can bring in your family members, which leads to chain migration, and greatly liberalized the number of people coming into this country. If I remember my statistics correctly, by 1850, 10% of the country was foreign born. I think 1900, the percentage in this country that was foreign born is about what it is now, if not slightly more. But because of the 1924 law, the immigration was restricted, and by 1970, it was a very low percentage of people that were foreign born in this country. In that year, maybe about 5%. So no, it's gone back up since. But this is my question, because as you were talking, I was listening, and everyone who's been listening to the show is aware of how hardened society has become in the past few years. People are intolerant of one another. There's so much anger that seems to be everywhere, from airplanes to things that's happening on the street. The point I'm getting at is this uncontrolled immigration. People, different mores, different values, different cultures, is that contributing to that sense of anger and divisiveness and that we have now?
Well, I think absolutely, because people are looking and they're angry about the level of immigration, and they're looking in their communities and they see a community that they don't even recognize in terms of its cultural, its values, its history. So I think that's been part of it. And then also just the part of, again, no matter how great immigrants are, you just have a more diversified society, and a more diverse society, I argue, again, is one with a lot more challenges to kind of creating the sort of unified policy that I think is sort of the most strong both at home and abroad. And I think you touched on these numbers very meaningfully. I mean, in the late 19th century, we got up to about 14.3% or something immigrant, which was the highest it had been, and was one of the things that led to us having these immigration restriction laws. But by 1970, that had gone down to 4.7%. And these were very disproportionately old at that point. So it was that was the world I was born into. And it's a radically, radically different world than the world that we're experiencing today.
How long does it take to fully assimilate a new group? Are we talking about one generation, several generations?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the willingness of the group to assimilate. It depends to a degree on physically observable difference. I mean, I think this is there's no way to kind of whitewash this and make it easier than it is, right? But like if I'm a Polish American, or even more maybe an Irish American, but like whatever, and I show up in America in the late 19th century, and I marry somebody of eventually of Pilgrim ancestry, and we have kids, not only whatever mores and everything else that those kids will inherit, but physically you probably couldn't tell, unless you're some sort of racial expert in some weird way. You couldn't tell the difference between that person's kids and the kids of somebody who'd been there for generations and generations. When you add the kind of multiracial or multi-ethnic kind of dimension of this, that becomes harder. Now, again, maybe among some groups, Hispanics that also have a lot of European ancestry, if they're intermarrying with white non-Hispanics, their kids, not just in terms of culture, but in terms of their ethnic background, they may kind of resemble a lot more America's historical majority. But for other groups, it's not always going to be that easy. And then again, it depends on how much does the group want to assimilate and how much does the society want that group to assimilate. So I think unless you really messed it up, it's not going to be like a 5-generation process. I think in 2 or 3 generations, people tend to be pretty assimilated. I know that they've done, for example, work on 3rd-generation Hispanics in the United States. And I think pretty overwhelmingly, they speak English as their first language, for example, right? So you can point to certain signs like that where assimilation does happen. But again, assimilation is never just a one-way street. So the problem is if the groups are big enough, the receiving culture changes in some pretty fundamental ways. And if you're like me and maybe you're not always fond, not that it's ever going to be completely static, but you're not fond of totally transforming the existing culture, then that's its own problem that needs to be dealt with.
I think the Chinese culture is most famously effective at assimilation. The Mongols who came in became actually the leaders of China, became more Chinese than the Chinese themselves after a generation or two.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And China, I kind of did a lot of Chinese history as an undergrad. China was notoriously great for this. You had the Manchus, you had the Mongols, and all of them became heavily Sinicized over time. And that can go in interesting reverse ways. For example, I lived in India as a newlywed. My wife and I are both Americans, but we moved out there. I was doing work out there. The most British people I ever met in my life were upper class Indians, much more so than any upper class people I met in Britain. They really had kind of assimilated certain sorts of British cultural mores from the Raj era that even a couple generations down were still very durable in sort of how they presented themselves and how they thought about themselves. And of course, I'm not suggesting that within that they didn't still obviously have a large degree of inherentness and respect and pride in their own culture. But it is to say that receiving and giving cultures can unsurprisingly have really big effects on each other.
Well, culture and race often get identified as being synonymous, but in my point of view, they're really not. We talk about the white culture, but it could just as easily have been, in theory, a black culture or brown culture or whatever. But we're really talking about a culture that originated in Western Europe and that was transplanted and then built and developed upon in this country beginning in the Enlightenment period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do not make the mistake in my book of conflating race and culture, or even ethnicity and culture. I mean, I think I've touched on the Hungarian example in the previous episode as a kind of extreme example of how you can have those two things be very disjoint. But at the same time, it tends to not be totally irrelevant over time, ethnicity with respect to culture. And so you need to respect that reality. But yeah, I mean, I ultimately think that it's a good thing that ultimately somebody from whatever background can eventually become an American, or certainly their children can become fully American, and by kind of embracing what I would consider the traditional American principles and goals. But the problem is, of course, now that's just my perspective. We don't necessarily have a view on what those goals are. And again, at the level of immigration that we have, it becomes very difficult to sustain the existing culture without it really being disrupted and changed in some pretty fundamental ways that, at least speaking personally, I'm not necessarily fond of changing. I kind of liked the country that I grew up in, and I don't want to fundamentally transform it.
Well, you have a couple of interesting quotes in your book, and it's just fascinating to me to see the arc and that's happened in the past 100, 120, 25 years or so, which you bring to light in your writings. And I want to talk about that for just a moment, but it also implicates the current culture wars. What's right and what's good. What good is entitled to be transmitted to the next generation. What's evil that doesn't want to be and should be canceled for whatever reason. And I think in the late maybe around 1900, Rudyard Kipling wrote his poem "White Man's Burden," and it was unapologetic. It was something that he was proud of. I think it was written to encourage the United States to join the Europe and the countries to help to, quote, civilize other countries. I think in that particular instance, it was a reference to to the Philippines. Well, of course, by today's standards, that's racist. I understand that. But then by the 1960s, Susan Sontag, and you quote this in your book, wrote that the race is the cancer of human society. And it seems as if his writings in 1960 have really had a profound impact, along with a lot of other people as well, in terms of a lot of thought processes in this country today. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely right. And you kind of went from sort of one sort of stream, and Rudyard Kipling is kind of the avatar of a certain colonial mindset. And I use that. I mean, the word colonial and colonialist has just become so abused in recent decades that there's sort of some automatic assumption that when I say that I'm being really critical. No, I mean, I think colonialism had some certain things that it did that were very beneficial, and it did, certain things about it that were not beneficial for the countries that were being colonized. But Kipling represented, with his kind of idea of this white man's burden, the extreme end of that civilizational confidence. And I say extreme, we would look at it now as extreme. At the time, it was very mainstream, which is why he had such a following as he did. And he was also, of course, a very astute observer of and a fond observer of the country, India, that he lived in. A very, very different sort of mentality than the Susan Sontag mentality, which I think you correctly note has sort of taken over things, where the white man is the cancer of human history. And I think that that trade has maybe not necessarily been such a good one.
And it certainly has crept into the political debate, I think, over immigration, how immigration law should be structured in this country and enforced, which kind of brings me to the point. We've been talking about legal immigration and illegal immigration. Let's talk a little bit about the laws on immigration. And this is very confusing. On media and television, cable channels, everybody throws a lot of terms without really ever defining them or giving them any kind of structure. And it's not really clear to a lot of people, including myself, what exactly is legal and illegal. And now, getting ready for this interview, I did a little work. My understanding is that under current law, there's about 675,000 visas authorized annually. There's supposed to be an application process from someone wanting to come to this country, a application that's supposed to be made outside the country, and the visa is given to someone that comes here. Those would be, I assume, legal immigrants. And then on top of that, you have people who legitimately are seeking refugee status for one reason or another. We can think of, in Vietnam, with the collapse of the South Vietnam, a lot of Vietnamese came to this country as refugees. Cuba in the early 1960s, the same thing, and there's been other examples of that. What is the basis of everyone else coming to this country? The flood of people coming to Mexico, coming across the border. We call those illegals. Are these people officially seeking refugee status, but not doing it according to what is required legally?
So it's a mix, and I'm glad you brought this up because it's an important concept. So some do seek refugee status. And here I think an important thing to note. So basically, almost none of these people, this is a dirty little secret you don't get from the kind of so-called mainstream media. Almost none of these people have legitimate asylum claims. There's a variety of which doesn't mean that, I mean, first of all, most of them are just economic migrants, no matter what they're claiming. Okay. So like, let's dispense with that.
And Jeremy, on that point, then, asylum. So we're talking about people who are legitimate asylum seekers, those who are being politically persecuted, as opposed to coming from a country that doesn't have the same economic opportunities as they might find in this country.
Correct. So that's, the vast majority of these people are not actually fleeing, even their kind of own terms, any sort of political persecution. They're just looking for better economic opportunities. By the way, I want to stress again, because I'm really, I don't try to bash the immigrants. I bash the leaders of our country that have allowed this to happen. I mean, I spent years in the developing world. I have full appreciation for why a lot of those folks want to come here. I'd probably be making a lot of the same decisions they made if I were in their shoes. But that's different than what America should be doing. So first of all, you have to understand the vast majority of these people, whether or not they're even making an asylum claim, are just economic migrants. Then, even beyond that, if you look at those who are making asylum claims, there are various rules of political asylum that basically say, like, the first place you get to that is kind of not your country, in which you're not going to be actively super persecuted, that's where you have to make your asylum application. So that is almost never the United States for any of these people. So that's why I say that virtually all of these asylum claims are not legitimate. So, if they're going through Mexico and you're a Salvadoran, of course, now El Salvador's kind of turned around, but if you're a Honduran or a Venezuelan or whatever, you can't just go through 12 other countries and show up in America and claim asylum at our borders. It doesn't work like that. I mean, functionally, unfortunately, it does, but the law says that it doesn't. And the media, because they love, in general, illegal immigration, and I'm if that sounds harsh, it's just the reality. I mean, that's revealed by the way they cover it. They tend to avoid just kind of this basic demonstrated fact. So almost none of the group of people who are arriving here as sort of unauthorized immigrants have any legal claim to be here whatsoever. They're either economic migrants, in which case they have no claim to be here, or they are people with legitimate asylum claims, perhaps somewhere, but they would have had to make it in another country. And in the Trump administration, there was an effort to, in fact, make those folks, through the Remain in Mexico policy, at least have to make their asylum claims at the border. And they were still lying all the time. And again, I'm not trying to be harsh. I understand why they're lying. They want to get in America. But at least they had to go through an authorized process, and they weren't in America when they did it. When Joe Biden took office, that was one of the first, I think even first day, they undid. So, that encouraged a lot more illegal immigration.
My understanding of the numbers is that during the Trump administration, the number of illegals, not including the gotaways, was probably down to about 1,800 to maybe 1,500, average maybe 1,000 per day. And as you pointed out, once Biden took office and he became president, the policy changed to the point where almost immediately the number of illegals crossing, not including the gotaways, went up to 4, 5, 6,000 per day. And today it may be as high as 14 or 15,000 per day, not including the gotaways. Are those numbers anywhere on point?
Yeah, I mean, I have to kind of do the math in my head, but it sounds plausible. I mean, it's important. I have in some of the work I've done, kind of graph of the numbers of illegal immigrants that we've had over periods of time, and you see them certainly being much, much higher in the early in recent Democratic administrations. So it's much higher than they've ever been historically. But Biden, if you were to show it, it's just off the charts. I mean, it's not quite an order of magnitude, but it's several times greater than really any other illegal immigration time that we've had in the United States. And that's because illegal immigrants have gotten news that Biden's just going to let them in. He has no interest in enforcing the law. So people will come in, they make their fake asylum claim, they are transported at taxpayer expense to the interior of the country, where they're then fed and clothed and done all sorts of other things at taxpayer expense. And in many cases, if not most, they have to wait years for their hearing, which is not really an inconvenience to them, because they can still they're authorized to be in the US at the time that that's going on, you can't really do anything about them. And that's one of the reasons why I've seen hearings scheduled for as long as 7 or 8 years from the date. So it's just absurd. I mean, it's a flagrant dereliction of duty by the president. I'm not going to say anything more about it than that, but it's really hard to square with any sort of respect for America and its laws.
With those who are met at the border, is there any assessment about those individuals, where they come from, whether they have any criminal history, any issues associated with threats that they may pose in terms of the health and well-being of other people in this country when they arrive?
In theory, there should be, but again, you can imagine government record keeping and everything else. We saw there were red flags about the 9/11 terrorists, right? Not all of them, but some of them. And they got lost in various parts of the bureaucracy, right? So I'm not going to say that we never catch anybody through that or that we don't ever identify any people of concern. But between the gotaways and the people that we're not catching through that, you're letting a lot of very dangerous, potentially dangerous criminal aliens into the country. So that's another real part of it. I sometimes don't even talk about that as much because I feel like it can be a diversion from talking about the very question of immigration itself, which to me is separate from like whether these immigrants are criminals or whether they're really smart and lovely people. But I think it's a fair thing to talk about. I mean, and if anything, maybe I've gone too much the other way where I'm sort of ignoring the actual threats to national security and crime that are real. And we've seen a lot of this. If you're on the right on Twitter, you'll see unfortunately a lot of cases where people who are not here legally have committed horrific crimes and with very little consequence.
Let's just change the focus just slightly from the perspective of the politics of it. And it's not very clear what all the politics are at play behind this. And in terms of the decision to open up the border, whether the real reasons are being given for that or whether they've ever been really articulated, other than the fact it's an anti-Trump reaction to what Trump did. But what are the real reasons? If you're a history of American football, you go back to the 1920s, one of the great open field runners was Red Grange, who's the so-called galloping ghost. And I think when it comes to politicians, they're all experts at being a good galloping ghost. They may say, but the reason why they want to accomplish a certain policy is not disclosed. So when it comes to opening up the borders, the most common reason you hear, at least from commentators on the right, is because the left wants to increase the power of the Democratic base. I think you even make the point in your book that with increased immigration, the politics of the country generally drift to the left as opposed to the right. Another possibility may be that we are not even replacing ourselves. I think our birth rate is about 1.6, where I think you have at least 2.1 per births per woman of childbearing years to replace our population. So you can an argument that maybe we want the immigration to increase to maintain a growing population, have a healthy, large workforce age population to support the senior citizens and all of that. And the third reason that occurs to me, what might be behind this, is because, again, if people are implementing the Susan Sontag interpretation of history that the white race is the cancer of all society, we need to replace the white race, which gets into replacement theory, which is some people claim that as being racist, and that's a whole nother debate itself. But what do you think are the real reasons why the Democrat administration wants to open up the borders the way it has?
Well, I think all of them are vaccinated. I think probably the biggest is the first one that you identified, which is the Democrats see this rightly or wrongly as a way to expand their power base because they know that they've won precisely one election, I think, since World War II among white voters. So anything they can do to expand a non-white voting base, they're going to do that. Now, I think we're seeing there are some limits to that strategy. You begin to see this in 2020 when Trump won some counties in South Texas that had not gone Republican for a generation. And these are like 99% Latino counties or 98% Hispanic counties. And I think we're going to see even more of that in the upcoming election. I think Trump is going to do very, very strongly, at least on a relative basis, with Hispanics. And maybe that'll change the immigration policy a little bit, ironically, because of that. But I think that political thing, I think the need to provide, I don't say need, I should strike that word, but the desire of US businesses to have cheap labor, which is, of course, not really cheap because they end up just foisting the cost for the healthcare and housing and everything else and social services on the American taxpayer. But a lot of American businesses want cheap labor, so they're going to welcome illegal immigration for this reason as well. Finally, as you kind of point out, I think there's some people within the bureaucracy who are kind of constitutionally anti-white, and they want to replace the existing majority white population with other populations for their perceived political benefit and social benefit, and because they just don't like white people in general. And I think for that's not probably decisive at this point, but I think it's just one of the many things that contributes to the situation that we're in.
It's been a fascinating conversation, Jeremy. When we return for part 3 of your interview, we're going to talk about another fascinating concept you raise in your book, which you call the cell-association parallax. I'm looking forward to that conversation. Thanks for being with us on this episode of the Fourscore and 7 Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. My name is Roger Clark, your host. Be sure to like and share us with your friends, and be sure to join us for part 3 of our program with Jeremy, when we will continue to explore the immigration crisis in America.